Hi, this is a video just to go over what we did in class last week, looking at how to think about a shift out in demand when the government enters a market. Okay, so let's start as we always do with a nice demand curve. Let me get this better in the screen. Okay, so we've got a demand from the private sector for particular good. Okay, so that's our demand curve. And then we've got supply from the private sector for that good. Okay, let me adjust there. Good focus here. All right, and so what we talked about in class was what happens if the government enters the market and how does that affect overall surplus in the market. And so what you want to think about is how is the government entering the market? Is it entering at a given price? Obviously it's not going to be able to force people to sell to them at a certain price, but maybe it's going to say I'm going to buy and I'll pay up to this amount. Or is it entering and it will pay any amount? So first let's think about it coming in at a certain price. So let's say that we've got an equilibrium price and quantity, right? P star, Q star. And the government's willing, because it knows it's going to disturb this market by coming in, it's willing to pay up to this price, right? So this is the price max the government will pay. And let's say that if the price is below that, the government will buy an additional 100 units, right? And so what we want to think about is there are some consumers that have a willingness to pay that's higher than that P max, right? So they're going to be in the market when the price is high, right? And so as the price drops, more and more private sector companies come into the market. And then at P max, what we have is a shift out in demand equal to the number of units the government's going to buy. So let's say that's 100 units, right? And basically what the government's going to do is at any price, it's going to buy 100 more units, right? So what it's going to do is it's essentially going to shift the demand curve out by 100 units at any level below P max. And so if you wanted to then just trace what does the demand curve look like, it's sort of a funky looking demand curve, but it looks like this, right? So that's the overall demand. It represents both private sector demand and government demand, okay? And so if we want to think about what that does to the market, let's look at consumer surplus before this shift. All right, so initially what we had is consumer surplus was equal to the difference between the willingness to pay and the price paid. And producer surplus was equal to the difference between the price paid and the marginal cost of production. Okay, now the new price, right? The new price is going to be here, right? So it's going to be a higher price, right? So let's call that P prime. And then we're going to have a higher quantity. So let's think about what happens to the producer side first, because the producer side is really easy, right? They're just selling more units at a higher price. And so they're going to add this area right here to their producer surplus. So producer surplus is going to go up by this area, right? Now consumer surplus, two things have happened, right? For the consumers, right, there's been a shift in price. So consumers are going to get less surplus, right? So now it's just the difference between the price and their willingness to pay. And some consumers are out of the market, right? And so what we have is that this green area that is really going to the producers, some of it is coming from the former consumers, right? So the former consumers, the guys that are still in the market, they've all lost this, right? It's been transferred explicitly to the producers. And then they've also lost this area because they're not purchasing that, okay? Now, that area is being purchased by the government, and so the government is basically transferring that surplus area to the producers, right? So it's getting taken away from the consumers. The producers are getting it, and it's coming to them from the government now. So it used to come from the consumers, now it's coming from the government, right? Because essentially the government is paying for this many units, right? And so they're adding this part of producer surplus as well as this part, right? Because they're buying all of these units. And so the additional producer surplus is here. And so what we have is this net gain. It's hard to show. This net gain of this triangle here is a new producer surplus that's not coming from consumers, that's coming from the government, right? And so to make this clear, let's kind of put some letters here. So we'll call this A. So consumers initially get the area A, P star, Q star, right? This big triangle. And now they're going to get A, P prime, and Q prime minus the government amount, which we said was 100 units. Right? So we said the government's going to buy 100 units at any price less than P max. All right, and so now the consumers are getting A to P prime to Q prime minus 100, right? So that's what this point is. The producer surplus, initially, they get 0 to P star to Q star. Now they get 0 to P prime to Q prime, right? And so what we've got is a transfer of surplus from consumers to producers, right, this area here, and then an increase in additional surplus that's coming from the government, right? So the big thing is that the government is essentially buying this, it's paying this whole amount here, right? The area, this 100 units, area between Q prime and Q prime minus 100 times P prime. So all of that is government revenue that's lost. Some is going to pay for the opportunity cost of producing. That's what everything is below the marginal cost curve. And then some of it is going to the producers as producer surplus. Okay, so hopefully that is clear. If you have any questions, come see me and we can go over it in person. Thanks a lot.